The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield with support services designed to help seniors age in place, including a Compass Memory Support Neighborhood. More at armbrookvillage.com.
This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. Good morning, I'm Carrie Saldo. It's Friday, December 6th. Tired of those Thanksgiving leftovers? Well, we have plenty of fresh news for you this week to help cure what ails you. Here on The Rundown with me this morning, Jill Kaufman from the NEPM Newsroom.
Good morning.
Good morning. Kevin Moran, the executive editor of the Berkshire Eagle.
Hi.
Hi. And Gary Yoakum, investigations editor with the Springfield Republican newspaper.
Good morning.
So glad to have all of you here this morning. Later, we'll discuss the alleged deed fraud that's going on here in Western Massachusetts and what's being done to help prevent it. We'll talk about how trash is yielding some treasure in the Berkshires, and we will remember two local legends tied to the Western Massachusetts music community. If you, dear listeners, have thoughts on any of that and want to get in on the conversation this morning, email the rundown at nepm.org. We begin this morning with a story out of the Commonwealth Beacon magazine. The headline, 2024 fire season in Massachusetts burns more acres in 2 months than in the previous 2 years. And this story comes from Mamati Bocataria. The beginning, she writes, as drought conditions worsened this fall, more acres burned in wildfires in October and November of this year across Massachusetts than have burned in the past 2 years combined. David Salino, who's the chief fire warden at the Department of Conservation and Recreation, told Commonwealth Beacon the wildfires raging are unprecedented, not just because of how rapidly they spread, but also because this scale of wildfires is not typically seen until typically seen in the spring. It's very unusual for this to be happening in late fall. Now, I think probably top of mind for all of us is what has come to be known as the butternut fire in the Great Barrington area. Kevin, what did those drought conditions that we read about in the Commonwealth Beacon piece mean that firefighters there in the Great Barrington area were contending with?
Yeah, the butternut fire it actually burned on East Mountain and ended up burning like well over 1,600 acres. But it started on November 18th. And as everyone can recall, it's hard to recall now because we've got a little bit of snow on the ground, but as everyone can recall, for weeks leading up to mid-November, our whole region was undergoing severe drought conditions. Things were like tinderboxes. We saw all those and heard all those warnings about, don't light fires outside, don't burn leaves, don't throw a cigarette.
Which is like a horrible time of year to be getting these notices because lots of people are eager to do fall cleanups. Maybe you want to burn that brush pile that's been hanging around for weeks, and we were not supposed to be doing any of that.
Yeah, can't have any of that. Well, it turns out that when this fire started, it just had all of that tinder throughout East Mountain, ready to go. And it was not necessarily a hot fire, which means it did not necessarily take down all those trees that we see like commonly like in the California wildfire. There's roaring, 200-foot tall flames, it seems like. But we did have a serious ground fire that, really gobbled up so many acres, and it took hundreds of firefighters. It took helicopters, scooping up water from local ponds and trying to, drop the water on. And, it burned for 2.5, almost 3 weeks, And
recently, was it this week or late last week that we got the all clear saying that it was contained?
Just over this past weekend,
yeah.
They declared that they had, they had effectively contained the fire. There were probably still hot spots out there. This week's snow certainly helped that a little bit. But, we're going from not a lot of snow last year to all of a sudden snow in mid-November, and quite a bit of it, actually. And we're going from drought conditions to wet conditions. this is climate change.
Yeah, yeah. And I think two things that stood out to me in my mind. One thing that the Berkshire Eagle did that I truly appreciated was the live blogging that you all did that was updating, minute by minute sometimes. It was photos, it was information. It was, at one point, it was stop giving us donations, folks, because there were so many people from the surrounding communities that wanted to help send water or snacks for the firefighters and the support teams that were there. And the other piece that I wanted to bring up is that these were largely volunteer firefighters.
Absolutely.
And the Berkshire Eagle told
Yes.
me this information.
Yes. Hundreds of volunteer firefighters. And, we're so used to seeing some of our, Northeast firefighters go out and help fight fires out west. But now the East Coast is becoming this. As a matter of fact, just this past summer, there was a wildfire in New Jersey in which, a firefighter died. And it's been decades since they've had, a firefighter east of the Mississippi die fighting a wildfire. And, this is just something that we're going to have to get used to, I think.
Yeah, and then the Massachusetts statewide fire mobilization plan, where you essentially borrow a firefighter from another region because local firefighters have essentially exhausted their bench, and whether that's a professional firefighter department or a volunteer. According to Commonwealth Beacon, that program was activated 15 times from late October to late November. However, most fire departments were tied up fighting their own fires, which meant that fire departments and fire crews are just stretched incredibly thin trying to get through all of this. Greta or Jill, thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about the mutual aid element of this, which you're describing, and about resources being tapped, and the notion that in small towns, fire departments are largely volunteers. So
and largely looking for more volunteers.
Right. So which has been getting harder, which you've been covering more than I have. So yeah, like where will be the person power on this? But I just also wanted to say that I remember being I wasn't covering these fires, but in Holyoke on Mount Tom, there are fires that start that's very close to a metropolitan, close to a city between East Hampton and Holyoke. And if it happened back, this was maybe 8 years ago, these things are likely to happen also near cities. One fire I read, I think in the Republican or in the Gazette, was near UMass Amherst, near enough a dorm. So what we're seeing is something, as you said, climate change, something to come. So
I think another thing that was remarkable is that because of the work of these firefighters, homes were not impacted. There were a couple of close calls, but they remedied that situation, right? And if I recall, we don't have any major injuries from any of the fire staff or volunteers, right?
No, luckily we did not.
Any idea, though, of how this started? I know in the beginning there wasn't a sense.
They are looking now. They are looking for not necessarily what started it. They have identified a location, but they're looking they're talking about looking for who started it. And so whether it's intentional, accidental, good question. But it's an active investigation.
All right. I'm sure the Berkshire Eagle will stay on top of that. I'm going to move us on to our next topic of this morning. Also out of the Berkshire Eagle, Jane Kaufman wrote this. Windsor is planning to revive its long-closed landfill and make it an educational forest. Now, I'm from the days when we used to just call it a dump, but landfill, transfer station, fancier names these days. A rusted gate blocks the entrance to this town's long-closed landfill, but in the future, that gate may be open to a world of learning about a forest in a changing climate. A local group plans to reopen the town's naturally capped landfill, as well as the 99 acres surrounding it. However, it wouldn't be as a dump, but as an educational tool, Kaufman wrote. Kevin, what's going on here?
No relation also. No, we've run into each other.
So this is kind of an interesting this is an interesting piece. Yeah, Windsor. We all remember. Well, at least people of a certain age who live in Massachusetts remember that we used to have open landfills. You used to drive there on a Saturday morning, and throw the garbage, and you're back in an open dump there. But since then, for example, in Windsor, around 1985, they ended up closing these things and capping them. Well, it turns out that 30 years later, all of a sudden, you've got a forest growing over it. And what the state is doing is that they're studying, once again, climate change. And they're taking this particular example, and because Windsor is such a heavily forested town. Just to give perspective, there are probably more deer And maybe as many deer that live in Windsor as maybe people. Maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration.
Yeah, we're talking about 12
Lots of
or
woods.
so miles
Yes.
northeast of Pittsfield. It's a rural community.
Yes, and so Windsor's kind of worried about, like, they're looking at the East Mountain fire going, oh my gosh, what's this portending if one of our forests catches fire? But the state of Massachusetts is giving a little bit of money to many towns, including some in the Connecticut River Valley, to take a look and to study these particular forests. And and here you have a sort of a petri dish, an area that was totally open, scarified, 40 years ago as a landfill, that has now been filled in. It is now overgrown. And what they want to do is study that rejuvenation of that forest to figure out, okay, what's going on here? And of course, stack that up against what they see as climate change data. And they want to figure it out. They want to know, how forests are going to react and respond to fires or regrowth. All that kind of stuff in the coming years.
And you mentioned that money. It seems like a little bit, about $100,000 from two different pools, reading Jane's story, and seed money to help kind of turn this old landfill into this educational forest. What are some of the early ideas about opportunities for study, benefit that Jane found out about? There was something about... I thought was very interesting, collecting down limbs and trees to develop a community firewood bank, because this then ties into that whole wildfire piece that you were saying, that East Mountainside was a tinderbox.
Yeah, this is they carbon's a big thing, and we know trees store lots of carbon. So they want to take a look and assess how much carbon is held in these forests, and take a look at the limbs. They want to study the tree canopy and how the tree canopy is responding to these atmospheric studies. They want to keep an eye on the wildlife with cameras too, and see how wildlife are dealing with the fact
that
of
they're
these
going to have
regrowth.
a squirrel cam. I mean, that's amazing.
Absolutely. So who knows what eventually we'll end up learning about this. But these are some of the things that they've got a pair of binoculars out, and they're looking out into the future to kind of find out.
Not to throw a wet blanket on a landfill, but there's probably still also a lot of investigation into what's in that landfill. Is there leaching? Is this
because
really,
after all, we're throwing our trash in there. It's not like it's lovely green soil to be growing things in.
Probably an effort to recycle, which is glass and metal. It may not be the things that are leaching or plastics leaching. So I don't know the wetland scenario around this.
There's a wetlands around it, and it's near a portion of what becomes the Westfield River, if I remember correctly. Right. And that was one of the things I was wondering about too, Jill, because whenever I hear a landfill near water, my spidey sense goes off, and I wonder about groundwater leaching. And so I kind of took a look, and the EPA says that when they cap something, right? So in this case, the cap, it's not a neat, neat hat on this. It's the forest floor and trees, right, sufficing as this cap, but it's meant to reduce the amount of rainwater or snowmelt that then seeps through the material and gets below and then potentially into the groundwater, and that might carry those contaminants to maybe nearby wetlands or other things. So the hope
research is one thing, right? Like meaning the research into the growth of the forest versus a public land to walk on, and to maybe there's a center at the opening of this, but are people going to be entering this space and disturbing? And how much disturbance is there going to be of the property itself? And
Kevin, is there also the sense that there might be community partners involved in this to learn or to bring their own questions? Jane mentioned that in her story, I think.
Well, certainly that is part of the prospect. And there's going to be a lot of people involved. And obviously a lot of state and federal agencies probably interested, very much so, not only in the Windsor data, but in all the data. And they're studying, what they call municipal vulnerability preparedness is the technical term.
It's going to be the new buzzword for 2025. You heard it here on The Rundown. I also like that you mentioned the potential for this happening elsewhere in the Valley. I'm really curious about whether this might be replicated elsewhere. Got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's super exciting to hear. I'm curious to look into it here in the Valley and see what communities here might be doing.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to take a quick break here. When we come back with Jill Kaufman, Greta Kaufman, Kevin Moran, and Greta Yoakum, kids, we are going to look at how a prisoner jailed 1,300 miles away might be involved in deed fraud, and also remembering two women tied to the Western Mass music community. If you want to join our conversation, email therundown@nepm.org. This is The Rundown on 88.5. I'm Carrie Saldo. We'll be right back. We are back here on the rundown with the Berkshire Eagles' Kevin Moran, Jill Kaufman of the NEPM Newsroom, and the Springfield Republicans' Greta Yoakum. Greta, your investigation this week in the Springfield Republican uncovered an alleged housing scheme where at least one man, Felix Luis Cuevas Rodriguez, is allegedly researching public records of vacant, foreclosed, or abandoned properties, and then forging the deed documents, claiming that he owns the properties. I mean, this is the stuff that a Netflix mystery is made of. What is going on?
Yeah, so it started actually on election night for me when the Register of Deeds, she was up for re-election in Hampden County, won her race. And so I talked to her the next day. And one of the things that she was talking about in her campaign was trying to increase sort of security and anti-fraud kind of measures for when people record their deeds and other paperwork. And I kind of asked her, like, well, you know, what's your worry, or why is this important? And she told me this story of this woman in Springfield who went to her house that was vacant, and she wasn't living in it currently, and she found someone there who claimed that they owned the house, and showed the police the paperwork saying that they owned it, which was recorded in the Registry of Deeds, perhaps fraudulently, and sort of set off this whole story of this man who was in a prison in Florida, kind of doing this in different places in Connecticut and Massachusetts.
And then this is something that Cheryl Coakley Rivera has been raising awareness of as a result. But there's also this incredibly fascinating wrinkle where you're reporting on these latest allegations of 5 or 6 different instances that you found of these deeds that are sort of questionably changing hands. It's sort of a paper shuffle where between $10,000 and $49,000, the house was exchanged allegedly, and the rubber stamp is there from the notary. It sort of checks all the boxes, but when you look a little closer, as you did, they look relatively sketchy. But this also in some way connects to something that happened 5 years ago in Connecticut, where Ishmael Cortez ended up serving 1.5 years in prison after he pleaded guilty to his part in a scheme to rent houses, at least at one house in Connecticut, but he didn't own it. What's the connection between Cortez and this gentleman, Rodriguez?
Mm-hmm. So Felix, who is in a Florida prison for totally unrelated charges, has said in a lot of court documents that is his uncle. But Felix was also filing a fraudulent deed and was convicted as well of fraud. And what he did was he kind of orchestrated it from prison and had other people on the outside make the Craigslist posting. He had them file a deed and then rented an apartment in Enfield, or a home in Enfield, to an unsuspecting family who then found out after they had paid their last and security deposit that, you know, this wasn't something that they could live in.
So then coming back to the 413, you talked to the Springfield Police Department, and spokesperson Ryan Walsh said that there isn't enough evidence right now of forgery or proof of who was behind this for police to bring charges. But then is there other recourse for these alleged victims here?
That's a really good question. There was a lawsuit that Felix filed, a lawsuit, claiming the Springfield house was his that I mentioned earlier, and the woman then filed a countersuit, and it looks like she has won her suit, and his suit was tossed out. Recourse, yeah, it's a little bit unclear, honestly, what people can do, and the police kind of say, like, oh, well, the Registry of Deeds, maybe shouldn't have accepted it, and the Registry of Deeds is like, we can't really do very much. What are the police doing? So,
right, because the Registry of Deeds in your piece pointed out they don't necessarily have signatures to check. They just know that it needs to be signed by hopefully the rightful owner, and it needs to be notarized. But your piece also pointed out that the notary stamp in these pieces perhaps was stolen and belongs to people who were notaries but are now deceased.
Yeah, the notary worked in the Hampshire jail as a staffer in the library there, and passed away a couple of years ago. and told the Enfield police when they're investigating Felix in that state, in Connecticut, that when this man was alive before he died, that he did notarize some documents for Felix, but not the ones in question. And around the same time he was in the jail in Hampshire County, this notary stamp went temporarily missing. Questionable there.
One other thing that I noted in your story is the number of people who did not want to talk to you, and yet you persisted. So I have to say, like, congratulations. You dug in there, girl, and got the work done. That's really hard as a journalist to be trying to dig into something and have people who don't talk to you, but then to, instead of put the story back in the pile, maybe revisit it for later, you kept going. That's one of the things that stood out to me as I was reading this story.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, on that Eastern Avenue property that Cheryl Coakley Rivera brought to your attention, that was owned or is owned by Mary Sheehan. She bought it in 2017, right? And now this gentleman is claiming that he owns it per the quitclaim deed that was filed this year but dated 2018. Stick with me here, folks. We're gonna loop this all together. Do we have any sense right now of who owns that property?
I think from everyone I've talked to, that's like a question for the courts. The Registry of Deeds has made it pretty clear, like, they don't decide who owns something. They can just tell you who the last person is on a deed or on paperwork. So it's kind of a question for the courts.
I just wonder, and first of all, second of all, rather, following up on what Carrie said, great ears, keeping them open on election night and hearing this kind of story and then going after it. Did you see in your reporting that there was any rhythm to why properties were, jumped on, why these deeds were vulnerable?
That's a really good question. I think often it's ones that are in foreclosure or someone has died and they're kind of, not currently being lived in. One of them in Springfield was transferred after the person who allegedly signed it to transfer it had passed away. So things that, people aren't really living in actively.
Because I think for any homeowner, you read this story and it's unnerving.
Last night I went onto the Secretary of State's page, immediately registered, for this alert, which you put in your article.
Right. So one of the things that Greta pointed out in her reporting is that you can use this tool through the Registry of Deeds office that's free. What does it do, Greta?
Yeah, it's like an alert system. So it'll send you like a message after anyone files paperwork on a property that, you own. So it's sort of after the fact, but still good notification.
Something. Kevin, any thoughts on this?
Well, it's great reporting. That's what Greta Yoakum does.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely. Okay, well, I'm going to move us on right now to take a few minutes to remember two different women tied to the 413 in the music community who recently died. Jill Kaufman, tell us about the singer turned attorney whose music we're hearing now that you profiled.
Let's listen for just a moment. Let's listen. Yes. I don't get to say that much. So this is Leah Kunkel. She has been living in Northampton for a few decades, I believe. The tributes poured in from the music community and from the Smith College community after she died suddenly. She was diagnosed with some illness and died within 10 days. Okay, so that's what happened. In her early to mid-70s, she was a singer and an attorney. She was also the sister of Mama Cass Elliott from the Mamas and the Papas, but she was, as many told me and I read about, a singer in her own right. She was known as a backup singer as well for Jackson Browne, for Crosby, Stills, Nash, maybe Young, for Carly Simon, Art Garfunkel, and She continued to sing, but she became an attorney, and she became an entertainment attorney and also was a public defender. So there was just a great, from what I could tell from the community, a great generosity of spirit in who she was, and also a beautiful singer.
I noticed on her online obituary page just so many people posting there about the impact she had on their lives, the connection. What did you hear from some folks?
Well, I spoke to a few different folks, including Jim Olson, who is the founder of Signature Sounds and very involved in the Western Mass music scene, as you know, who used to be a DJ at WRSI. And he first met Leah Kunkel when he was playing her music, he told me, when she was part of a group called the Coyote Sisters. And so he first met her as an artist, he said. And in his take, he would say that her biggest strength was harmonizing, and that she didn't need to be the lead singer, even as she was in a time in the 70s and 80s, and she was part of this incredible music scene in Southern California before she came east. She was a fabulous harmonizer, and many hired her to be on their albums. She was also married to at one point to Russ Kunkel, who was a drummer, a very, very well-known drummer who happened to be in the area recently playing there was a tribute night at the Iron Horse, and I'm forgetting who it was covering. Oh my gosh. It was a Carole King tribute night, and he was the drummer on stage. And Jim Olson told me that Leah Kunkel was going to sing, and also said to him that she was friends with Carole King, and if she was on the East Coast, she'd get her to come to the Iron Horse.
Wow.
And Leah had, at that point, Miss Kunkel had at that point been quite ill and wasn't able to make it to the evening.
But just speaks to the depth of the relationships that she had.
Yeah, and one other thing I want to say is that I worked hard to write this as a story that didn't start with the line, the sister of Mama Cass Elliott has died. She was really a musician in her own right, and she came from a musical family. When Mama Cass Elliott died, I'm saying it that way so people remember who she is, Leah Kunkel raised her niece as her own, and they lived between, I believe, California, Massachusetts, and maybe somewhat in New York. And she has just come out with, the niece, whose name I've forgotten, has just come out with a new memoir called My Mama Cass. She was on the Fabulous 413. I will look up her name, and you can check that out too. So,
okay, great. And so we're going to move on to the Berkshires now. Headline on the Berkshire Eagle story: she's most known as namesake of Alice's restaurant, but friends remember Alice Brock for her talent and her spirit. Greg Sukenik told it this way in his story, quote, Alice Brock's impact in the Berkshires and beyond is more than the epic Arlo Guthrie's folk song that bears her name.
You can get anything you want at Alice's restaurant.
Now, Brock died on November 21st in Provincetown. She was 83. Kevin, first remind us of the story behind this Alice's Restaurant song, which is rooted in Stockbridge. Arlo Guthrie told this epic tale in 18 minutes. I'm going to give you approximately 30 seconds. Can you better his time?
Absolutely. Look, Arlo Guthrie, who wrote Alice's Restaurant Massacre, and his buddy Rick Robbins, they were teenagers. They knew Alice Brock when she was young down in southern Berkshire County. They decided, hey, it's 1965. You come on over to my house, Alice says, and I'll cook you some Thanksgiving dinner. They have that Thanksgiving dinner. In order to repay the favor, Arlo Guthrie, son of Woody Guthrie, and his buddies say, look, we'll take all the Thanksgiving Day garbage to the dump for you. Of course,
the Windsor dump? No.
No, not to the Windsor dump. But you know what? The dump that day, of course, it's Thanksgiving. It's closed, right? So they've got garbage bags in the back of the presumably VW bus. I don't know, but but they had to toss it somewhere, and where they tossed it turns out to be their bad luck, because you know what? Officer Obenheim from the Stockbridge Police Department
busted.
He saw them, and they got nailed, and thus becomes like this legend and lore of Alice's Restaurant Massacre, and
it's an epic tale rooted in the Berkshires.
Epic tale. Everybody knows it, but Alice Brock was a lovely woman by all accounts.
And you mentioned the food, right? She was a restaurateur, but she was so much more. What did people tell Greg Sukenik, ways in which they will remember her?
Well, she was a very creative person. She wasn't a musician, to my knowledge. Maybe she was that too, but she was obviously kind and generous. She was a business person, and she wrote a children's book, and she was just incredibly kind. And they called her vivacious and effervescent, and she really had a zest in a real love of life, and she sprinkled that on most everyone that she ever bumped into.
It was really fun going on the website tied to her artwork. I encourage anyone to do it. She's such a prolific artist, and she mentioned on the website that she was never trained, but it was just such a very, very important part of her life. All right, we're remembering these folks here today on The Rundown. I so appreciate the contributions from Jill Kaufman, Greta Yoakum, and Kevin Moran. You have been listening to The Rundown here on 88.5 NEPM. I'm Carrie Saldo. Have a wonderful day, everybody.